The barrier over the Jura Forest did not break or shatter. It simply ceased to exist. 1 second the magical protection was holding strong, and the next it was gone, replaced by a sky that looked like bruised skin. Purple lightning did not strike the ground but crawled across the clouds like living veins. The pressure hit the town of Rimuru instantly. It was not the heavy pressure of a demon lord. It was not the wild aura of a dragon. It was the weight of something that did not belong in this reality. The goblins in the streets fell to their knees, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The direwolves whined and pressed their bellies into the dirt, their instincts screaming at them to hide from a predator that had no scent and no shape. Rimuru Tempest stood in the center of the plaza and felt true fear for the first time since waking up in the cave. His body rippled uncontrollably. He tried to maintain his human form, but his arm melted into blue sludge and then snapped back into a hand. The great sage was shouting in his mind, but the words were broken. Error messages flooded his vision. The analysis failed over and over again. The magicals in the air were not just agitated, they were terrified. They were fleeing from a single point directly above the town. Rimuru looked up. The purple clouds parted in a perfect circle. There was no sound. The wind stopped blowing. The panic in the town was silenced by a sudden, absolute stillness. A column of light descended from the hole in the sky. It was not an attack. It touched the cobblestones of the plaza gently, like a feather landing on water. The terrifying pressure vanished, but it was replaced by a sense of awe that froze Rimuru in place. From the light, a figure stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with pale blue skin and white hair that stood up in a strange style. He held a long staff with a floating black gem. He wore robes that looked like they were made of wine-colored silk. He looked completely out of place in a town of monsters. He looked clean, elegant, and impossibly calm. The stranger looked around the plaza. He saw the destroyed stalls and the terrified citizens. He did not look angry. He did not look like an enemy. He looked like a gardener inspecting a flower bed that had been trampled. He tapped his staff against the stone ground. A soft chime rang out, clearer than any bell. The sound traveled through the town. Wherever the sound went, the crushed building stood back up. The cracks in the ground sealed. The purple sky turned back to blue. The heavy air became light again. In 3 seconds, he had fixed what Rimuru thought was the end of the world. The blue man turned his eyes towards Rimuru. The slime felt exposed. The great sage went completely silent, as if it was hiding. The stranger smiled, but his eyes remained sharp. He walked closer, his steps making no sound. He stopped a few feet away and leaned in, examining Rimuru as if he were a rare bug. He spoke in a voice that was polite and airy. He said that he had traveled a very long way because of a strange energy reading. He said that Rimuru was growing too fast and too carelessly. He said that when a child plays with matches, someone has to take them away before the house burns down. He asked Rimuru if he wanted to learn how to hold the fire properly, or if he should just extinguish the flame right now to save the neighborhood. Rimuru knew, without asking, that the neighborhood meant the entire universe. Rimuru Tempest remained frozen under the gaze of the pale stranger. The air in the central plaza was still vibrating from the sudden restoration of the buildings, a feat of magic that defied every law the great sage had ever explained. The silence that stretched between the slime and the angel was heavy enough to crush a lesser monster. Rimuru tried to speak, but his vocal mimicry felt clumsy, as if the air itself was refusing to carry a sound. He realized with a jolt of terror that he was not breathing because he did not need to, but the psychological need to gasp was overwhelming. The stranger, who had introduced himself only by his presence and his terrifying ultimatum, tapped his staff against the ground again. The sound was impatient. Rimuru forced his human form to take a breath and finally spoke. He asked who the stranger was and why he cared about a slime in a forest. The stranger tilted his head, the large halo around his neck shifting with the movement. He introduced himself as Whis. He explained that he was an attendant and a guide, but not for anyone in this particular universe. He said that typically he would not intervene in a lower reality, but Rimuru was making a mess that was spilling over the edges of the jar. Before Rimuru could process the concept of other universes, the silence was shattered. Shadow step portals opened simultaneously around the plaza. The delay in the Kijin's arrival had been due to the sheer density of the pressure Whis had exerted earlier, which had disrupted their spatial magic. Now that the pressure was gone, they arrived with lethal intent. Benimaru appeared in a wreath of black flame, his sword already drawn and swinging toward Whis's neck. Sue materialized from the stranger's own shadow, razor-sharp threads aiming to sever the hand holding the staff. Shion, screaming in a rage that shook the ground, brought her massive sword down from above, intending to split the intruder in half. Rimuru screamed for them to stop. He knew, with an instinct that bypassed logic, that this was a mistake. He reached out to grab them with his sticky thread, but he was too slow. The attacks connected, or rather, they should have connected. There was no sound of impact. There was no explosion of energy. Benimaru's sword passed through the space where Whis's neck had been, meeting only air. Sue's threads fell limp to the ground as if they had been cut, though Whis had not moved a muscle. Shion's massive blade struck the stone pavement, cracking it, because Whis was suddenly standing 3 feet to the left. He had not teleported. There was no fluctuation of magicals that indicated movement. He was simply there, and then he was not. Whis looked at the Kijin with mild curiosity, as if he were watching puppies stumble over their own paws. He commented that their speed was adequate for mortals, but their intent was too loud. He said that shouting before you strike is polite, but inefficient. Benimaru roared and gathered a sphere of hellfire, the heat intense enough to melt the nearby glass windows. Whis sighed. He lifted his pinky finger and flicked the air. The motion was microscopic. The result was catastrophic. A shockwave, concentrated and invisible, struck Benimaru in the chest. The ogre commander was launched backward through 3 buildings, his flames extinguished instantly. Sue and Shion froze, their instincts screaming that death was 1 inch away. Whis lowered his hand and looked at Rimuru. He said that if the slime could not control his subordinates, he certainly could not control the power of a universe. He raised his staff, the black orb glowing with a cold light. He stated that he would remove the variables to make the lesson simpler. Rimuru threw himself between his friends and the angel. He dropped to his knees, his forehead touching the stone. He shouted that he accepted the offer. He begged Whis not to hurt them. He promised to learn whatever Whis wanted to teach. He promised to hold the fire. The glowing orb dimmed. Whis smiled, a genuine, pleasant expression that was more terrifying than a frown, because it showed how little effort it took him to decide between life and death. He said that was a wise choice. He told Shion and Sue to retrieve their friend and prepare a meal. He had traveled a long way, and destruction work always made him hungry. He specified that he wanted to taste the local cuisine, and if it was disappointing, he might reconsider his decision to spare the town. The transition from near apocalypse to a dinner party was jarring. The Kijin were traumatized, their pride shattered in less than a second. They moved like ghosts, obeying Rimuru's frantic mental commands to stand down and cook the best meal of their lives. Rimuru remained with Whis in the plaza. The angel began to walk around the town, inspecting the architecture. Rimuru followed, his human form feeling heavy. He tried to ask the great sage for an analysis of Wiss's power level again. This time, the response was not an error. It was silence. Rimuru asked internally if the sage was there. A voice spoke in his mind, but it was not the mechanical voice of the great sage. It was Wiss's voice. It echoed inside his head, bypassing his ears. Whis told him to stop consulting the calculator. He said that relying on an automated system to understand reality was why Rimuru was so sloppy. He said that true gods do not calculate. They simply know. He tapped the top of Rimuru's head with his staff. The connection to the great sage went dead. It was not destroyed, but it was walled off, suppressed by a barrier Rimuru could not even perceive, let alone break. For the first time, Rimuru was truly alone in his own head. They sat in the reception hall. The food was brought out in waves. Shuna, trembling but composed, presented dishes of tempura, sushi, and stewed monster meats. Whis ate with delicate precision. He paused after every bite, closing his eyes. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every time Whis picked up his chopsticks, the executives of the Tempest Federation held their breath. Finally, after eating a piece of high-grade Tempest Serpent tempura, Whis made a sound of delight. He said the texture was primitive, but the flavor profile was surprisingly complex. He praised the use of distinct spices. The room exhaled. Rimuru felt his sludge body relax. He asked Whis if this meant the town was safe. Whis wiped his mouth with a napkin and said that the town was safe for now, but Rimuru was not. Whis stood up and beckoned Rimuru to follow him outside. They walked to the outskirts of the town, near the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and ancient. Whis stopped and turned to face the slime. He said the training would begin immediately. He explained that Rimuru's power system, which he called magicals, was a crude imitation of true energy. It was volatile, wasteful, and leaked constantly. He pointed at Rimuru's chest. He said that Rimuru was like a bucket full of holes, constantly pouring water into the desert and calling it a lake. Every time Rimuru used a skill, he wasted more energy than he used. The predator skill, in particular, was dangerous. Consuming souls and energy without digesting them properly created a spiritual density that was warping the local reality. That was what had drawn Wiss's attention. The universe was bending around Rimuru's stomach, and it was starting to crack. Whis drew a circle in the dirt with his staff. It was a simple circle, about 10 feet in diameter. He told Rimuru to stand inside it. Rimuru stepped in. Whis tapped the edge of the circle. A cylinder of transparent light shot up into the sky. Rimuru felt a sudden, crushing weight. It was not gravity. It was containment. The cylinder was reflecting his own aura back at him. Usually, Rimuru's aura flowed out into the world, intimidating monsters and sensing his surroundings. Now, it had nowhere to go. It hit the wall and bounced back, slamming into his own body. He fell to his knees. His skin felt like it was burning. He tried to suppress his aura, but he didn't know how. He had always just let it flow or actively pushed it. He had never truly pulled it all the way in. Whis watched him struggle. He said that the first lesson was not how to destroy, but how to exist without destroying. He told Rimuru that he was forbidden from using any skills. No black lightning, no dark flame, no shape-shifting. He had to maintain his human form and his consciousness using only his core willpower. If he slipped, the pressure of his own reflected aura would crush him into a mindless slime. Rimuru gritted his teeth. The pain was excruciating. It felt like his soul was being compressed into a marble. He looked at Whis, pleading with his eyes for a hint. Whis merely watched, his face blank. He said that until Rimuru could contain his entire existence within his own skin, he was not permitted to leave the circle. Hours passed. The sun began to set. The Kijin watched from a distance, forbidden by Whis to interfere. They saw their master trembling, sweat pouring down his face, his body flickering between human and slime. Rimuru was fighting a war against himself. Every instinct he had developed since coming to this world was screaming at him to release the energy, to use a skill, to ask the great sage for a solution. But the sage was silent, and the barrier was absolute. Rimuru had to find a new way to hold himself together. He began to visualize his energy not as a river, but as a whirlpool, spiraling inward. He focused on the center of his chest. He pulled the leaking magicals back into his core. The burning sensation increased, then suddenly snapped into a cold, heavy solidity. The pressure in the cylinder eased. Rimuru gasped, falling forward onto his hands. He was still in human form. He felt denser, he felt heavier, but he was not leaking. Whis clapped his hands slowly. He said it was a passable first attempt. He lowered the barrier. Rimuru stood up, his legs shaking. The world looked different. Colors were sharper. Sounds were distinct. Without the constant noise of the great sage and the haze of his own leaking aura, his physical senses were heightened. Whis told him that this was the baseline. From this moment on, Rimuru was never to leak energy again. He was to keep everything contained. This was the foundation of God Ki, though Rimuru was nowhere near that level yet. This was simply integrity. Whis then dropped the second bombshell. He said that because Rimuru had condensed his energy, he had essentially disappeared from the magical radar of the world. To the outside world, the demon lord Rimuru, or the aspiring one, had vanished. This would have consequences. Weakness invites aggression. By hiding his power to control it, Rimuru was inviting his enemies to strike. Whis said this was part of the test. A god does not rely on intimidation to keep the peace. A god maintains order through presence and action. He asked Rimuru if he was ready to defend his town without his aura, without his major skills, and without his advisor. Rimuru looked at his hands. He felt strong, but in a way that was unfamiliar. He felt small. He looked at the town, where the lights were flickering on for the evening. He realized that for months, he had been skating by on the borrowed power of Veldora and the automated brilliance of the great sage. He had been powerful, but he had not been competent. Whis was right. He had been a child with a matchbox. He looked up at the angel and nodded. He said he was ready. Whis smiled, but this time it was a sharp, predatory smile. He said that was good, because something was coming. He pointed his staff toward the darkening sky. Rimuru looked up. Far in the distance, beyond the mountains, the sky was not purple, but it was disturbed. Birds were fleeing. Clouds were swirling in unnatural patterns. The suppression of Rimuru's aura had indeed created a vacuum. The local balance of power had shifted. The monsters of the Jura Forest, sensing the disappearance of the great predator, were reacting. But it wasn't just wild monsters. Whis explained that there was a difference between a king and a deity. A king rules because he is the strongest in the room. A deity rules because he is the room. Rimuru had been playing king. Now he had to learn the difference. Whis turned and began walking back toward the town. He said he required dessert. He suggested that Rimuru get some rest, because the next day they would begin physical conditioning. Rimuru asked what kind of conditioning. Whis replied that they would be carrying stones. Rimuru thought that sounded easy. Whis added that the stones would be weighted with the gravitational pull of a collapsing star. Rimuru froze. Whis laughed, a high, polite sound. He said he was joking. He said they would start with merely the weight of a mountain. As Rimuru walked back to the town, he felt the absence of the great sage keenly. He tried to formulate a plan for the next day, but his mind felt slow. He had to think for himself. He had to analyze the threats, manage the logistics, and understand the politics without the cheat code. He saw Rigurd organizing the patrols. He saw the goblin riders checking their wolves. They looked to him with absolute faith. They didn't know he had been stripped of his greatest weapons. They didn't know he was terrified. Rimuru clenched his fist. He couldn't tell them. If he showed fear, the fear would spread. He had to be the pillar, even if the pillar was currently hollow. That night, Rimuru did not sleep. He sat in his hut, meditating as Whis had shown him, pulling his energy inward, compressing it, refining it. He felt the hunger of the predator skill gnawing at him, demanding to be fed, demanding to expand. He fought it down. He visualized the whirlpool. He visualized the cold, hard center. Somewhere around midnight, he felt a strange sensation. It was a pulse, not from him, but from the earth. With his senses heightened and his own noise silenced, he could feel the ley lines of the forest. He could feel the movement of armies miles away. He realized he had been deaf to the world because he had been shouting too loud. Now that he was whispering, he could hear everything. And what he heard was the sound of marching feet. Thousands of them, coming from the east. The orcs were moving. But in the original timeline, the orc disaster had been a chaotic, hunger-driven swarm. This sounded different. The footsteps were rhythmic. They were disciplined. They were not just marching. They were being driven. Rimuru opened his eyes. He realized that his timeline had already diverged. Whis' arrival, or perhaps the mere potential of it, had rippled backward or outward. The variables had changed. The Orc Lord was not just hungry. He was being guided too. Rimuru stood up, ready to wake Benimaru, but stopped. Whis had said he had to defend the town without his aura. If he went out there and blasted them, he would fail the lesson. If he failed the lesson, Whis would erase him. He had to fight an army, but he couldn't fight like a monster. He had to fight like a general. He had to fight like a god, in training. Rimuru walked out of his hut and looked at the moon. Whis was sitting on the roof, holding a cup of tea. The angel didn't look down. He simply said that the enemy was 3 days away. He asked Rimuru if 3 days was enough time to become something new. Rimuru jumped up to the roof, struggling slightly without his enhanced jump assist. He landed beside Whis. He said 3 days was all he had, so it would have to be enough. He asked Whis if he was going to help. Whis took a sip of tea. He said he was a guide, not a bodyguard. He would watch. If Rimuru died, then Rimuru was not the one. It was a cold, binary statement. Rimuru accepted it. He looked east, toward the approaching sound of the drums. There was no going back to being just a slime. He was now a candidate, and the entrance exam was war. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought weight. Rimuru Tempest was dragging a boulder the size of a carriage across the cleared ground of the training field. But the physical mass of the rock was irrelevant. The heavy, weighted vest Whis had materialized onto Rimuru's human form was the true burden. It did not just pull him down. It pulled his essence inward. Every step required a conscious negotiation between his slime physiology and the artificial gravity pinning him to the crust of the planet. There was no great sage to automate the motor control. Rimuru had to manually fire every nerve impulse, coordinate every muscle fiber, and maintain his balance. His breath came in ragged gasps, a purely psychological habit that he couldn't break, his mind screaming for oxygen it didn't strictly need but desperately wanted. Whis sat on a floating stump 10 feet in the air, peeling a fruit that looked like a blue apple. He did not offer encouragement. He offered corrections. He pointed out that Rimuru's left foot was dragging. He noted that Rimuru's core was leaking a microscopic amount of aura with every exertion. He remarked that if this were a combat scenario, Rimuru would have been dead 3 times in the last minute. Rimuru grit his teeth, the grinding sound loud in his own ears. He adjusted his posture, pulling his energy tighter, compressing the whirlpool in his chest until it felt like a solid ball of lead. The leaking stopped. The pain increased. Benimaru and Hakuru watched from the edge of the field. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and horror. To them, their master had suddenly become weak. They could not sense his power anymore. To the naked eye, Rimuru looked like a struggling human child, sweating and stumbling under a load that a hobgoblin could lift. It terrified them. If they couldn't feel his strength, how could they trust in his victory? This psychological fracture in the chain of command was the first crack in the foundation. Whis had engineered it. He was stripping away the cult of personality that Rimuru had accidentally built. If they followed him now, it would be for his decisions, not his aura. Sui appeared in a blur of motion, kneeling before the training circle. He did not look at Rimuru. He looked to the ground, unsure of how to address a master who looked so fragile. He reported that the lizard men of the marshlands were engaged. The report was grim. The orc invasion was not a chaotic swarm as anticipated. It was a siege. The orcs were using shields. They were building bridges. They were not just eating the lizard men. They were capturing them. Sui hesitated before delivering the final piece of intelligence. He said that the Orc Lord was not on the front lines. He was holding back, commanding from a mobile fortress carried by 10 giant orcs. Rimuru dropped the boulder. The ground shook. He looked up at Whis. The angel took a bite of the fruit and chewed slowly. Rimuru asked if he was permitted to leave. Whis swallowed and said that the training ground was wherever Rimuru stood. The condition remained the same. Rimuru was forbidden from leaking aura. He was forbidden from using the great sage to process strategy. He could go to war, but he had to go as he was right now. If he broke the seal of his energy to cast a massive spell, Whis would consider the test failed. Rimuru asked what failure meant. Whis smiled pleasantly and said he would destroy the planet to prevent the unstable growth from contaminating the timeline. It was not a threat. It was a promise of administrative cleanup. The march to the marshlands was a nightmare of logistics. Without Rimuru's ability to use shadow motion or mass teleportation, the Tempest forces had to move physically. The delay was excruciating. Every hour they spent marching was an hour the lizard men were dying. Rimuru rode a direwolf, his body aching from the residual pressure of the training gear, which Whis had not removed. He felt blind without the radar of the great sage. He had to rely on scouts. He had to read the map himself. He had to trust his commanders. When they arrived at the edge of the wetlands, the catastrophe was already unfolding. The smoke was thick, smelling of burning peat and roasting flesh. The lizard men's defensive lines had shattered. The orc army was a wall of yellow-green skin and iron. They moved in phalanxes, locking shields, stabbing with spears. This was not the mindless hunger Rimuru remembered from the original timeline. This was a legion, and in the center of the carnage, the orc general was directing the flow of troops with hand signals. Rimuru ordered the charge. The Kijin launched themselves into the fray. Benimaru's black flames carved a path through the orc ranks, but the orcs did not scatter. They reformed. They threw water and mud on the fires. They adapted. Hakuru moved like a wind, severing heads. But for every orc he killed, 2 more stepped into the gap. The sheer weight of numbers was being applied with intelligence. Rimuru drew his katana. He jumped off the wolf and ran into the mud. The combat was visceral. Rimuru couldn't blast them away. He had to cut them. He had to dodge. He felt the impact of a spear against his blade, the vibration traveling up his arms. He kicked an orc in the chest, using his slime strength to shatter its ribs, but he couldn't expand his body to swallow them. He had to stay small. He had to stay contained. He fought his way toward the center, his eyes scanning for the leader. Then he saw him, the Orc Lord, Geld. He was massive, standing nearly 10 feet tall, clad in scavenged plate armor that had been bolted together. He held a cleaver that looked like a guillotine blade, but his eyes were the worst part. They weren't red with madness. They were clear. They were sad. And they were intelligent. Beside him stood a figure that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't Gelmud. It was a human in a hooded robe, holding a crystal sphere. The human whispered to Geld, and the Orc Lord nodded. Rimuru realized with a jolt of horror that Whis's presence had caused a reaction in the world's balance earlier than he thought. The presence of a higher being had attracted other eyes. The Eastern Empire, Clayman. Someone had accelerated the Orc Lord's evolution to counter the anomaly in the Jura Forest. Geld saw Rimuru. The Orc Lord didn't roar. He simply pointed his cleaver. The Orc phalanx shifted, creating a corridor, inviting Rimuru in. It was a trap, and Rimuru had to walk into it. He signaled Benimaru to hold the flank. He stepped into the ring of mud and blood. Geld stepped down from his carrier. The ground squelched under his weight. The duel began with a scream of metal. Geld swung the cleaver with terrifying speed. Rimuru dodged, the wind of the blade cutting his cheek. He struck back, aiming for the gap in the armor at the knee. His sword connected, but the skin underneath was as hard as iron. Steel skin, Rimuru realized. Geld had already evolved beyond a normal Orc Lord. He had defensive skills. Without the great sage to analyze the weakness, Rimuru had to guess. He struck again and again, sparks flying. He was faster, but Geld was durable. And then Rimuru made a mistake. He relied on a habit. He anticipated a follow-up swing and moved to block, intending to use the gluttony light absorption to catch the blade. But Geld didn't swing. He punched. A massive fist, glowing with yellow aura, slammed into Rimuru's chest. The impact was devastating, because Rimuru was compressing his aura to satisfy Whis. His natural slime elasticity was rigid. He didn't bounce, he broke. His ribs shattered. The breath was driven from his lungs. He flew backward, crashing into a pile of rubble. He gasped, coughing up blue fluid. The pain was blinding. In the old timeline, auto battle mode would have parried that. Pain nullification would have masked it. Now, he felt everything. He felt the jagged edges of his own body. He tried to heal, but the energy required to regenerate instantly would spike his aura. He felt Whis's gaze from somewhere high above. If he healed fully, he failed. If he failed, the world ended. Rimuru had to stand up with broken ribs. He wheezed, forcing his body to knit slowly, manually, using only the ambient magicules already inside his tissues. It was agonizing. Geld walked closer, raising the cleaver for a killing stroke. The human in the robe laughed, a sharp, jarring sound. "Is this the anomaly?" the robe man mocked. The master expected a demon, not a child playing soldier. Rimuru looked at the Kijin. They were fighting desperately, surrounded. If he died here, they all died. But he couldn't use gluttony to eat Geld. It would leak too much energy. He had to use the training. The whirlpool. Geld brought the cleaver down. Rimuru didn't dodge. He stepped into the swing. He placed his hands on the flat of the blade as it descended. He didn't push against it. He accepted the kinetic energy. He visualized the whirlpool in his core spinning faster, not outward, but inward. He absorbed the kinetic force of the blow, not the matter, just the energy. His arms screamed as the energy flooded his circuits. It was too much. His skin cracked, blue light bleeding out. "Contain it," Rimuru screamed internally. He twisted the absorbed energy, adding his own rotation, and released it through his palms into the Geld's chest armor. It wasn't a blast. It was a vibration. The one-inch punch principle, amplified by the kinetic weight of the Orc Lord's own attack. Impact. The armor didn't break. It liquefied. The vibration shattered the molecular bonds of the metal. Geld's chest collapsed inward. The Orc Lord coughed blood, stumbling back, his eyes wide with shock. He fell to one knee. Rimuru stood over him, swaying. His hands were burned black from the energy friction. He had won the exchange, but the cost was immediate. The release of energy had been controlled, but barely. He felt the sky darken. Whis was watching. That was the edge. But the catastrophe was not over. While Rimuru had focused on Geld, the robed man had acted. He smashed the crystal sphere on the ground. A massive purple summoning circle expanded beneath the mud. "If the Lord falls, the swarm rises," the man shouted. From the circle, spirits did not rise. Instead, the mud itself began to animate. The dead bodies of the lizard men and orcs melted together, fusing into a chaotic, writhing mass of flesh and rot. A Charybdis seed, a biological weapon implanted in the battlefield as a failsafe. It wasn't fully formed, but it was massive, a mountain of meat and teeth that screamed with 1,000 voices. It lashed out, a tentacle of bone and mud striking the distracted Benimaru, sending him flying into the swamp water where he didn't resurface. Shion screamed, abandoning her post to dive after him. The defensive line collapsed. The orcs, confused by the monstrosity, panicked. The discipline broke, but not into a rout, into a stampede. The Tempest forces were in the path of the stampede. Rimuru looked to the chaos. He was injured. His top commander was down. A biological horror was rising, and he was out of magic. He looked at Geld, who was wheezing on the ground. The Orc Lord looked at the monster, then at his own people being crushed. "Save them," Geld rasped. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. Rimuru made a choice. He couldn't fight the monster and the army. He offered a hand to Geld. "Order them to stand down. I will kill the beast, but you owe me your soul." Geld looked at the small, broken slime. He nodded. He roared, a sound bubbling with blood, ordering the orcs to halt. The discipline held. The orcs froze. Rimuru turned to the flesh mountain. He couldn't blast it. He had to dismantle it. He looked at his burned hands. He had to do it manually. He began to run toward the beast, not with a spell, but with a sword he picked up from the mud. He was going to dissect it, piece by piece. High above, on a cloud that went unseen by the combatants, Whis tapped his staff. He checked a pocket watch. "Sloppy," he murmured. He broke 3 ribs and compromised his structural integrity. But Whis watched Rimuru dive into the mass of rotting flesh, cutting with surgical precision rather than brute force. He didn't fire the laser. He used the scalpel. Whis took another bite of his apple. "Let us see if he survives the infection." On the ground, the battle turned into a grinder. Rimuru fought for 4 hours straight. He cut, he dodged. He was covered in black ichor. The toxins in the beast were eating at his skin. and without his auto-immunity fully active, suppressed to save energy, he felt the burning itch of corruption. He was feverish, but he kept moving. He found the core of the beast, the robed man, fused into the center, and drove the sword through his heart. The beast collapsed into a lake of sludge. Rimuru stood on top of the pile, gasping. He looked down. He saw the survivors. The lizard men were decimated. Half their population was gone. The Kijin were battered. Benimaru was being carried by Shion, unconscious and pale. The orcs were kneeling, waiting for judgment. Rimuru didn't feel like a winner. He felt heavy. The victory wasn't clean. It was dirty, painful, and costly. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He had won without the cheat codes, but the price was etched into the faces of his people. They looked at him with a new kind of respect. Not the worship of a god, but the grim respect for a soldier who had bled with them. He climbed down. He didn't give a speech. He just nodded to Rigud. Treat the wounded. All of them. Even the orcs. As the sun set over the marshes, Rimuru collapsed. He didn't faint. He just sat down in the mud and couldn't get back up. The fatigue was absolute. For the first time, he slept not because he wanted to skip time, but because his body shut down. Whis landed softly nearby. He didn't heal Rimuru. He didn't clean the mud off him. He simply stood guard, his staff glowing faintly in the twilight. Lesson 2 complete. Whis whispered to the sleeping slime. You have learned pain. Now you must learn consequence. The timeline had shifted irrevocably. The surviving lizard men were not grateful allies. They were broken refugees. The orcs were not a workforce. They were a burden of guilt. And somewhere in the east, the true puppeteer had seen Rimuru's face and realized that the slime was not a demon lord seed, but something far more dangerous, a variable that refused to play by the rules of power. The escalation had begun. The return to the town of Rimuru was not a triumphal march. It was a funeral procession for the concept of easy victory. The 150,000 orcs did not vanish into magic particles, nor did they evolve instantly into a high-functioning labor force. They were flesh and blood. They were starving, and they were crowding into a settlement designed for a tenth of that number. The logistics of survival replaced the immediate threat of war. The air in the town smelled of unwashed bodies, wet fur, and the smoke of too many cooking fires burning green wood. Rimuru sat in the central meeting hall, which was now a chaotic command center. Maps were spread across the table, weighed down by stones because there was no time to craft proper weights. Rigud looked 10 years older. His skin, usually a lustrous deep green, was pale and dusty. He reported that the food stores would last 3 days. The water filtration, usually handled by passive magic, was failing because the local spirits were unsettled by the sudden shift in the region's aura. Without Veldora's chaotic energy, or Rimuru's leaking power to feed on, the minor spirits of earth and water were going dormant. The forest was technically dying, or rather, it was entering a hibernation state to conserve energy. Whis stood in the corner, examining a wooden cup with polite disinterest. He did not offer solutions. He had made it clear that his role was to train Rimuru's soul, not to manage his municipal infrastructure. When Rimuru asked about the starving orcs, Whis had simply replied that a god who cannot feed his followers will soon have no followers. It was a brutal truth that cut deeper than any blade. Rimuru realized he had to make a choice that would permanently alter the social structure of his federation. In the original history, he had named everyone. He had distributed magicules like candy, elevating the goblins to hobgoblins and the orcs to high orcs. granting them intelligence and strength to build a civilization. Now, he checked his internal reserves. The whirlpool technique Whis had taught him allowed him to retain his energy, but it also made him acutely aware of his limits. Without the great sage to manage the distribution efficiently, naming someone was a manual surgery on their soul. If he slipped, he would drain himself dry and enter a sleep mode from which Whis might not let him wake. He looked at Geld, the son of the Orc Lord, who was kneeling in the dirt outside the hall, waiting for judgment. He looked at the goblin captains. He made the decision. He would not name the population. He could not. Rimuru walked out to the balcony. The crowd fell silent. He announced that there would be no mass evolution. He would name only the leaders. Geld would receive a name. The goblin riders' captains would receive names. The rest would have to earn their evolution through training, labor, and time. A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. They had felt the power radiating from him before Whis arrived. They knew what he was capable of. Now they saw a leader withholding his gift. It was the first time Rimuru felt the burden of resentment. It was faint, but it was there. He proceeded with the ceremony. He named the orc leader Geld. The drain was immediate and terrifying. Without the sage's optimization, the energy rushed out of Rimuru like water from a burst dam. He clamped down on the flow, cutting it off the moment the name settled. Geld evolved, his yellow aura flaring, but the other orcs remained hunched and starving. The following week was a blur of desperate negotiation. Rimuru sent runners to the kingdom of Dwagon, not as a visiting dignitary, but as a petitioner begging for grain. King Gazelle Dwago arrived personally 3 days later, riding a Pegasus, his eyes hard. He did not meet Rimuru in the reception hall. He met him in the fields, where Rimuru was manually tilling the soil alongside the orcs, his human hands blistered. Gazelle watched the slime-turned boy working the hoe. He sensed no aura. To the Dwarf King's senses, Rimuru appeared to be an ordinary human child. The intimidating pressure of a demon lord seed was gone. Gazelle dismounted and demanded an explanation. He asked why the entity that had devoured the orc disaster was now playing farmer. Rimuru leaned on his hoe, wiping sweat from his forehead. He explained the doctrine of containment. Gazelle scoffed. He said that a king who hides his sword invites thieves. He broke the alliance. He stated that Dwagon allied with powers, not potential. Until Rimuru could prove he was a deterrent, there would be no trade deals, only charity. He left 500 sacks of grain, enough for 2 days, and flew away. It was a humiliation that burned, but Rimuru couldn't argue. He had no leverage. The chain reaction of perceived weakness spread faster than Rimuru anticipated. The forest, usually a zone of absolute terror for intruders, was now seen as open territory. Scouts from the Falmuth kingdom began probing the borders. Mercantile groups from the sorceress dynasty of Saurians sent surveyors to map the resources, ignoring the goblin patrols. Rimuru was forced to deploy the Kijin, not as commanders, but as border guards, stretching his elite forces thin. Then the sky broke again. It was not the gentle descent of Whis. It was a sonic boom that flattened the trees for a mile in every direction. A crater appeared in the main plaza, destroying the newly rebuilt fountain. From the dust emerged a figure that radiated power so intense it made the air taste like ozone. Milim Nava had arrived. In the original timeline, she came to play. In this timeline, she came to investigate a void. She stood in the center of the crater, her pink hair floating in the updraft of her own energy. She scanned the town with dragon eye, looking for the monster that had silenced the Jura Forest. Her eyes landed on Rimuru. She frowned. She walked up to him, sniffing the air. She poked his forehead. She said he felt empty. She asked where he was hiding the magicals. Rimuru, remembering Whis's warning about maintaining his cover, tried to play dumb. He introduced himself as the leader. Milim laughed. She said he was a liar. She raised her fist to deliver a playful punch that would have vaporized his upper body. Before the punch could connect, a staff intercepted it. Whis had stepped between them. He did not block the punch. He redirected it. Milim's fist slid off the smooth wood of the staff and struck the air to the right, blowing a hole through 3 mountain peaks in the distance. The sound of the collapse arrived seconds later. Milim froze. Her instincts, honed over millennia of combat, screamed at her. She jumped back, landing on top of a surviving building. She stared at Whis. Her pupils contracted to slits. She recognized the energy signature. It wasn't demonic. It was divine. Whis smiled and placed a finger to his lips. He told Milim that this was a classroom, and she was disrupting the lesson. Milim looked from Whis to Rimuru. A look of dawn-like realization crossed her face. She realized that the slime was not weak. He was being muzzle-loaded. The boredom that usually plagued her vanished. This was interesting. She declared that she would stay. She wanted to see what kind of weapon the angel was building. Rimuru tried to protest, citing the food shortage. Milim ignored him. She reached into her dimensional pocket and dumped a pile of raw honey on the ground. She said she brought her own snacks. She sat down on the rubble and demanded to be entertained. The presence of Milim Nava changed the strategic calculation instantly. The scouts from Falmuth fled. The surveyors from Sarian vanished. But her presence also acted as a beacon. The other demon lords, who had been watching the Jura Forest with mild interest, were now alarmed. Why was the destroyer sitting in a goblin village? Clayman, the schemer, panicked. He assumed Milim was making a move to claim the Veldora seed for herself. He needed to disrupt the board before she solidified her control. Clayman accelerated his plans. He did not wait for the harvest festival. He contacted his pawn, Phobio of the Biscuiteers, who was currently en route to the forest on a diplomatic mission from Demon Lord Carrion. Clayman's agents intercepted Phobio and whispered poison in his ear. They told him that the slime had insulted Carrion. They told him that Milim was being held hostage by mind control. They gave him a weapon, a fragment of the Charybdis core, far more unstable than the one used in the marshlands. Phobio arrived at the gates of Rimuru 2 days later. He did not come to talk. He came to liberate Milim. He saw Rimuru, small and auraless, and assumed the worst. He spat insults, calling Rimuru a parasite. The Kijin bristled, but Rimuru held up a hand. He remembered the lesson. Emotional reaction leads to energy leakage. He tried to de-escalate. He spoke calmly, asking Phobio to state his grievances. Phobio, fueled by the Charybdis fragment and his own pride, saw the calm as arrogance. He activated the fragment. In the canon timeline, Charybdis was a separate entity that possessed Phobio from the sky. Here, the fragment was a parasite that fed on the negative energy of the void Rimuru had created. The magicals in the area, starving for a host, rushed into Phobio. The transformation was grotesque. Phobio's body did not just mutate. It exploded outward, flesh tearing and reforming into the scales of a sky shark. He didn't summon Charybdis. He became Charybdis right there in the town square. The shockwave leveled the first ring of houses. The orcs who had been working on repairs were vaporized. A massive, single-eyed shark head erupted from Phobio's torso, screaming with a voice that shattered glass. Rimuru stood his ground, the wind tearing at his clothes. He looked at Whis. Whis was eating a spoon of Milim's honey. He did not look up. Rimuru looked at Milim. She was clapping, excited for the violence. She made no move to help. "This is your mess," Whis said softly, his voice cutting through the roar of the beast. "You starved the forest of energy, so the forest found a new host. Deal with it." Rimuru realized the horror of the situation. He couldn't use gluttony to eat this. The Charybdis Phobio hybrid was a magical reactor. If Rimuru tried to eat it, the conflicting energies would detonate inside him, and without the sage to isolate the isotopes, he would die. He had to kill it physically. The battle was confined to the city limits. This was the nightmare scenario. Rimuru couldn't lead the beast away. It was rooted to the ley line intersection under the plaza, drinking the earth's power. Rimuru drew his sword. It was a standard katana, reforged by Kurobe, but it was just steel. He channeled his aura into the blade, compressing it until the steel glowed white-hot. "Benimaru, containment wall," Rimuru barked. "Sue, evacuate the civilians. Shion, cut the tentacles." The Kijin sprang into action. They were terrified, but they moved. Rimuru launched himself at the beast. He was faster than before. The weighted training had rewired his nervous system. He dodged a bite that would have swallowed a house. He ran up the side of the shark monster, slashing at the gills. The steel bit deep, but the flesh regenerated instantly. Magic interference. The beast had the skill to disrupt magic. Rimuru's aura-infused sword flickered and died. He was thrown off by a thrashing tail. He crashed through the roof of the meeting hall. He lay in the debris, looking up at the monster that was destroying his home. He felt a spike of pure, unadulterated rage. He wanted to release the seal. He wanted to let the storm out. He wanted to burn the world to ash just to kill this thing. "Don't," Whis' voice echoed in his head. "Anger is a leak. Anger is waste. Focus." Rimuru closed his eyes. He forced the rage down into the whirlpool. He spun it. He compressed it. He felt the heat in his chest turn to ice. He opened his eyes. The world slowed down. He saw the flow of magicules entering the beast. It wasn't generating power. It was sucking it in. It was a balloon. If he couldn't pop it from the outside, he had to overfill it. Rimuru jumped. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the mouth. He dove straight into the maw of Charybdis. Milim stopped clapping. "Oh," she murmured. Inside the beast, it was a hurricane of corrosive acid and teeth. Rimuru's skin began to dissolve. He didn't regenerate. He focused every ounce of his willpower on his core. He reversed the flow. Instead of pulling energy in, he opened the floodgates. But he didn't release it as an attack. He released it as raw, unrefined magicules. He dumped his entire reserve into the beast's stomach. "Eat this," Rimuru thought. The Charybdis Phobio hybrid roared, but the sound cut off. It was designed to absorb ambient energy, but Rimuru was feeding it the density of a true dragon's nephew. The creature's circuits overloaded. The scales began to glow. The regeneration failed because the cells were mutating too fast to hold form. Rimuru used the moment of paralysis. He didn't use a skill. He used physics. He solidified his sludge body inside the beast's throat, turning himself into a spike of diamond-hard material, and expanded violently. The beast burst. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was an explosion of meat. Charybdis was torn apart from the inside out. Phobio's body was thrown clear, unconscious and steaming, stripped of the parasite. Rimuru fell to the ground, a puddle of blue slime. He didn't have the energy to maintain human form. He was alive, but he was empty. The silence that followed was heavy. The town was half destroyed. Hundreds were dead. The survivors crept out of the ruins. They looked at the blue puddle. Whis floated down. He poked the slime with his staff. "Sloppy," he said again. "But you identified the structural weakness. You sacrificed your reserve to save the infrastructure. A kingly choice, if not a godly one." Milim walked over. She looked at the mess. She looked at Whis. Then she looked at the slime. She crouched down and whispered, "He's interesting. I'm keeping him." Whis' eyes narrowed slightly. "He is not a pet demon lord. He is a candidate." "Candidate for what?" Milim asked, her voice losing its childish edge. "For the position of administrator," Whis replied. The timeline had shifted again. In the canon, Charybdis was a raid boss that solidified the alliance with Dwargan and Milim. Here, it was a tragedy that proved Rimuru's vulnerability. The town was broken. The alliance was non-existent. And now, Rimuru was comatose, his core completely drained. But the consequences were escalating. Far to the west, the church had detected the massive influx of holy energy Whis had used to stabilize the area briefly during the fight. Hinata Sakaguchi stopped her training. She felt a disturbance that wasn't a monster. It felt like God. And she was coming to see why God was in a city of monsters. "That's it, Anne." The Kijin surrounded the bucket containing their master. They sharpened their swords. They realized now that Rimuru was not invincible. He was dying by inches to protect them. The loyalty that was once born of awe was now forged in fanaticism. They would burn the world before they let him carry another mountain alone. Rimuru Tempest opened his eyes to a ceiling made of rough-hewn timber, not the smooth, processed wood of his memories. The smell of medicinal herbs was thick in the air, masking the underlying scent of ash that seemed to have permanently settled into the pores of the town. He sat up slowly. There was no chime from the great sage to report his recovery status, nor was there a burst of stored energy to revitalize his limbs. His body felt heavy, dense, and singular. The sensation of being a slime mimicking a human was gone. He simply felt like a solid object occupying space. The training with Whis had fundamentally altered his physiology. He no longer existed as a cloud of magicules held together by will. He was a pressurized vessel. He walked out of the infirmary. The town was alive, but the rhythm was wrong. In the old timeline, the reconstruction would have been a joyous, magical affair, with spirits aiding the construction and feasts held nightly. Now the goblins moved with the efficient, quiet desperation of a workforce that knew winter was coming. The buildings were being repaired with stone and mortar, hand-mixed and hand-laid. The orcs, still working off the debt of their invasion, carried timber from the forest, their bodies gaunt, but their discipline absolute. They did not sing. They did not laugh. They worked because to stop meant to think about the hunger. Rimuru found Whis in the central plaza, or what remained of it. The angel was sitting on a transfigured lounge chair, teaching Milim Nava how to hold a porcelain teacup. The contrast was jarring. Milim, the destroyer, was trying to pinch the delicate handle with fingers capable of crushing diamonds, her face scrunched in concentration. Whis corrected her elbow placement with a gentle tap of his staff. He looked up as Rimuru approached. He did not ask how Rimuru felt. He simply stated that the recovery took 3 days longer than calculated, which meant Rimuru's efficiency was still suboptimal. Milim dropped the cup. It shattered. She looked at Rimuru, her eyes scanning him. She noted that he hadn't leaked a single drop of aura since waking up. She smiled. A sharp, dangerous expression. She said he was starting to feel less like a slime and more like a stone. Rimuru ignored the compliment. He asked for a status report. Rigurd appeared from the side, looking haggard. He reported that the trade routes were effectively dead. Dwargan was silent. The forest tribes were restless, but the most pressing news was from the west. A delegation from the kingdom of Falmuth had arrived at the border. They claimed to be a humanitarian mission, offering aid to the town devastated by the monster infighting. They requested entry to negotiate a trade agreement and to provide medical supplies. This was the inflection point. In another life, Rimuru would have been naive but optimistic. He would have welcomed them, eager to establish relations with the human nation. But the Rimuru of this timeline was tired. He was scarred. He looked at Whis. The angel was pouring another cup of tea. Whis said nothing, but his silence was a test. A god does not act out of fear, nor does he act out of hope. He acts out of knowledge. Rimuru knew that Falmuth was greedy. He knew they wanted the trade dominance, but his people were starving. The medical supplies were real. The grain was real. If he turned them away, he was condemning the injured goblins to death by infection and the orcs to starvation. Rimuru made the choice. He ordered the gates to be opened. He ordered the town to stand down and welcome the guests. He believed that with his new control, he could manage the situation. He believed that by showing restraint, by appearing small and harmless as he had in the training, he could disarm their aggression without violence. It was a choice born of Whis' doctrine. Control the self, and you control the room. It was a rational, strategic decision. It was also the mistake that would cost him everything. The Falmuth delegation arrived at noon. They were not merchants. They were soldiers in merchant robes. At their head rode a man named Folgan, and beside him, 3 individuals who felt wrong. They didn't feel like soldiers. They felt like glitches in the world, similar to how Rimuru used to feel before he compressed his aura. Otherworlders. Rimuru stood in the plaza to greet them. He wore simple clothes. He projected no aura. To the eyes of the Falmuth mages, he looked like a child. The leading mage, a man named Razan, smirked. He signaled the wagons to stop. The betrayal happened instantly. There was no negotiation. There was no preamble. The wagons dropped their sides, revealing not grain, but crystals. The mages activated them. A quadruple-layered barrier slammed down over the town. The prison field. In the original timeline, this barrier severed the link to magicals, weakening all monsters. But Rimuru was different now. He didn't draw from the outside. He was a self-contained reactor. The barrier didn't weaken him. It cut him off from the world, but his internal power remained constant. However, his people were not so lucky. The Kijin fell to their knees. The goblins collapsed. The connection to the spirits was severed. Then the slaughter began. The otherworlders, Shogo, Kyoya, and Kirara, didn't attack Rimuru. They attacked the town. They moved with the gleeful sadism of teenagers given godlike powers in a sandbox. Shogo kicked a goblin elder, shattering his spine. Kyoya sliced through the supports of the infirmary, bringing the roof down on the wounded. Kirara used her voice to command the direwolves to tear each other apart. Rimuru stood in the center of the chaos. Time seemed to freeze. He watched Shion, his loyal secretary, rush forward to defend a group of goblin children. She was weakened by the barrier. Her limbs were heavy. She swung her massive sword, but it was slow. Shogo caught the blade with one hand. He laughed. He punched her in the face. The sound was like a hammer hitting wet clay. Shan fell. She tried to get up. Shogo kicked her again, and again. Rimuru took a step forward. His eyes began to glow red. The whirlpool in his chest, the one Whis had spent weeks helping him build, began to spin in reverse. The pressure built. He was going to explode. He was going to erase them all. If you release it, you fail. Whis' voice cut through the red haze. The angel was nowhere to be seen, likely observing from high above the barrier, untouched. If you break your containment now, you destroy the town yourself. You become the disaster. Rimuru froze. He was trapped. If he unleashed his power to save them, the raw discharge of his compressed aura would vaporize the neighborhood. He had to maintain control. He had to fight with precision while his heart was breaking. He drew his sword. He moved. He intercepted Shogo just as the otherworlder was about to deliver a killing blow to Shion. Rimuru didn't use a skill. He used the flat of his blade to parry Shogo's fist. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, cracking the pavement. Shogo looked surprised. "Fast for a brat," he sneered. Rimuru didn't speak. He flowed. He ducked under a kick, slashed Shogo's tendons, and spun to kick Kyoya away. He was fighting 3 enemies and the barrier's suppression on his allies, all while holding back 99% of his energy to prevent a meltdown. It was a display of technical mastery that would have impressed a sword saint. But he was one person. He couldn't be everywhere. While he engaged the otherworlders, the Falmuth soldiers were advancing. They were killing the orcs who were too weak to fight back. They were burning the houses. The smoke rose, choking the sky. And then, the second hammer dropped. A woman walked through the chaos. She wore the white robes of the Western Holy Church. She held a rapier that hummed with a frequency that made Rimuru's teeth ache. Hinata Sakaguchi. She didn't look at the dying monsters. She looked at Rimuru. Her eyes were cold, dead things. She had come because she felt the presence of a false god. She saw Rimuru fighting with a precision that was not monstrous. She saw the lack of aura. To her, this confirmed it. He was a vessel for something else, something dangerous. "You are the anomaly," Hinata said. She didn't shout. She lunged. Her speed was beyond the otherworlders. It was beyond the Orc Lord. She was the pinnacle of human capability augmented by faith and magic. Her rapier, dead-end rainbow, thrust toward Rimuru's heart. 7 strikes in 1 second. Rimuru blocked 4, dodged 2, and took the 7th in his shoulder. The blade didn't cut flesh. It cut the soul. Rimuru felt a cold numbness spread from the wound. His spiritual integrity, the very thing Whis was training him to maintain, flickered. Rimuru disengaged, sliding back. He was bleeding. Behind him, he heard Shion scream. It was a cut-off, wet sound. He didn't look. He couldn't look. If he looked, he would lose the whirlpool. "Why are you doing this?" Rimuru asked, his voice flat. "Monsters mimic humans to deceive them," Hinata recited. "You mimic a god to mock them. I am the correction." She attacked again. Rimuru fought back. He couldn't use his magic. He couldn't use his gluttony. He had to use the sword. Clang, clang, spark. They danced through the burning plaza. Rimuru was losing, not because he was weaker, but because he was distracted. He could feel the lives blinking out around him. Every extinguished soul was a weight adding to the stone he carried. He needed to end this. He needed to use the forbidden technique, not a skill, but a manipulation of physics Whis had hinted at. The destruction of matter. Rimuru caught Hinata's blade between his palms. The skin sizzled. He looked her in the eyes. "I'm not mocking anyone," he whispered. "I'm just trying to live." He twisted his hips and threw her. It was a judo throw, simple and human. Hinata hit the ground hard. Rimuru didn't follow up. He turned his back on her. He ran toward Shion. Hinata stood up, preparing to strike him in the back. But she stopped. She saw it too. Shion was lying in a pool of blood. Her chest was a ruin. Shogo was standing over her, wiping his hand on his pants. He looked bored. "Tough meat," he muttered. Rimuru stopped 5 feet away. He looked at Shion. Her eyes were open. They were glassy. She was dead. The link between them, the soul corridor, was silent. There was no hum of loyalty, no warmth of devotion, just silence. The whirlpool in Rimuru's chest stopped spinning. It didn't explode. It froze. The absolute zero of emotional death. Rimuru looked at Shogo. The other worlder grinned. "You mad little man." Rimuru didn't answer. He raised his hand. He didn't use a spell. He pointed his index finger at Shogo. He visualized the atoms in the space between them. He visualized the bonds holding those atoms together. And he deleted them. "Erasure," Rimuru whispered. It wasn't a beam. It was a deletion event. A cylinder of space roughly the size of a grapefruit simply ceased to exist. It traveled from Rimuru's finger, through the air, and through Shogo's head. There was no blood. There was no scream. One moment Shogo had a head. The next, he had a smooth, cauterized stump. His body stood for a second, confused by the sudden lack of instructions, and then toppled over. The silence that followed was louder than the battle. Kyoya and Kirara froze. The Falmuth soldiers froze. Hinata lowered her sword. She had seen high-level magic. She had seen divine miracles. She had never seen reality simply give up. Rimuru walked over to Shion. He knelt down. He picked up her hand. It was still warm, but cooling fast. The great sage, suppressed but listening, finally broke through the silence of Rimuru's mind. Notification. Analysis of soul fragments complete. Resurrection is possible via the Harvest Festival. Requirement: 10,000 human souls. The invading army provides sufficient biomass. The solution was there. The path of the Demon Lord. Kill the invaders. Eat their souls. Ascend. Resurrect the fallen. It was the canon path. It was the easy path. Rimuru looked at the Falmuth army. There were 12,000 of them. Panic was setting in as the barrier fell. Whis had apparently decided the lesson had reached its conclusion and tapped the barrier crystals, shattering them from above. The monsters were regaining their strength. The tables were turning. Rimuru stood up. He could kill them all. He could become a true demon lord. He could save Shion. He looked up. Whis was descending. The angel landed softly on a pile of rubble. He looked at Shion's body, then at the terrified army, then at Rimuru. "A pivotal moment," Whis said. "You have the power to consume them. You can recycle their life to purchase hers. It is a transaction. A demon's transaction." "Can I save her?" Rimuru asked. "You can reanimate her," Whis corrected. "But if you fuel your evolution with mass murder, you contaminate the core we have built. You will no longer be a candidate for administrator. You will be just another lord of this mudball. You will have power, but you will lose the integrity of your soul. You will leak forever." "She is dead," Rimuru said. "Yes," Whis said. "People die, leaders fail, gods endure. Make your choice, Rimuru Tempest. Will you be a scavenger of souls, or will you be a judge?" Rimuru looked at Hinata. She was watching him, her hand gripping her holy symbol. She expected him to turn into a monster. She expected the massacre. Rimuru looked at the army. They were running now. "If I don't harvest them," Rimuru's voice trembled. "She stays dead." "Yes," we said. Rimuru closed his eyes. Tears, actual saline tears produced by his mimicry, ran down his face. He remembered the promise he made to himself in the cave. To build a nation where everyone could smile. He had failed. He had let the enemy in. And now, to fix it, the universe demanded he become a butcher. But Whis had taught him something else. The value of existence wasn't in its duration, but in its weight. If he sacrificed the core of who he was, a pacifist, a builder, to become a soul eater, He killed the ideal Shion had died for. Rimuru opened his eyes. They were not red, they were gold. I will not eat them, Rimuru said. I will not degrade her memory by building her a life out of garbage. He turned to the army. He raised his hand again. But I will not let them leave. He didn't activate the harvest festival. He didn't trigger the evolution. He activated the physics manipulation again. He focused on the air above the fleeing army. He compressed it. He created lenses of atmosphere, thousands of them. Megiddo, he whispered. But it wasn't the auto-aimed magic of the sage. It was manual. Beams of sunlight concentrated through the lenses. They struck the ground. But Rimuru didn't aim for the heads. He aimed for the weapons. He aimed for the wagons. He aimed for the legs. Thousands of screams rang out. The army was dismantled, crippled, burned, but not harvested. The souls were not collected. They floated up, grey mists dissipating into the ether, lost to the cycle of reincarnation. Rimuru fell to his knees next to Shion. The chance for resurrection passed. The window closed. The souls were gone. She was gone. Hinata walked slowly toward him. She stopped a few feet away. She looked at the devastation. She looked at the slime, who had refused the ultimate power. She saw the grief. It was raw and human. You didn't take them, Hinata said, confusion coloring her voice. You could have. I felt the ritual forming. Why? Because, Rimuru choked out, holding Shan's cold hand against his forehead. I am not a monster. Hinata sheathed her rapier. The dogma of the church was absolute. Monsters are enemies of God. But the being in front of her had just displayed more restraint than any pope she had ever served. She looked at Whis, who was watching with an unreadable expression. I will withdraw, Hinata said. The Western Holy Church will pause its crusade. But do not think this is forgiveness. This is curiosity. She turned and signaled her paladins, who had arrived at the outskirts, to retreat. They left the crippled Falmuth army to the mercy of the surviving monsters. Rimuru didn't watch her go. He sat in the silence. The orcs and goblins gathered around. They saw Shan. They saw the tears of their master. They didn't cheer for the victory. They wept. Whis walked over. He tapped the ground. A grave opened in the stone of the plaza. Rimuru placed Shion inside gently. He placed her sword on her chest. You chose the hard path, Whis said. You chose loss over corruption. That is the first step of a true deity. It hurts, Rimuru said. It is supposed to, Whis replied. Pain is data. Learn from it. Rimuru stood up. The grave closed. He looked to the town. Half of it was rubble. His secretary was dead. His innocence was dead. He had refused the Demon Lord evolution, which meant his power level was stagnant. He was vulnerable. But as he looked at his hands, he felt the whirlpool in his chest. It was no longer ice. It was something else. It was dense. It was heavy. It was real. He had not gained power. He had gained gravity. What now? Rimuru asked. Whis looked at the horizon where the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the graveyard of the ambition. Now, Whis said, we prepare for the one who sent them. You have broken the pawn. The king will be displeased. There was no festival. There was no resurrection party. There was only the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, and the silent, terrifying resolve of a slime who had decided that he would never, ever be kind to an enemy again. The Demon Lord Rimuru was never born. In his place, something colder and far more absolute began to take shape. The rain over the town of Rimuru did not cleanse the ruins. It merely turned the ash into a grey paste that clung to the boots of the survivors. There was no bustle of reconstruction, only the methodical, silent work of fortification. The grave of Shion sat in the center of the plaza, a simple mound of earth marked by her broken sword. Rimuru stood before it, water running down his human face, indistinguishable from the tears he had stopped shedding days ago. He wore a black coat woven from the thread of the hell spiders, not for style, but for armor. He carried no weapon. His hands were his weapon now. We stood a few paces behind him, holding an umbrella that seemed to repel the rain not by fabric, but by a subtle, repulsive force field. The angel checked the sky. The time for mourning was mathematically over. The time for politics had begun. A rift in space tore open above the damp plaza. It was not the elegant descent of a deity, but the chaotic, spiraling arrival of a fairy. Ramirez fell out of the portal, landing in the mud with a splash. In the old world, Rimuru would have laughed and helped her up. In this world, he simply turned his head, his golden eyes dull and heavy. Ramirez scrambled to her feet, sensing the oppressive atmosphere immediately. She didn't make a joke about his lack of snacks. She trembled. She held out a black envelope embossed with a wax seal of a dragon. It was the invitation to Walpurgis, the banquet of darkness. Clayman had made his move. He had called the council to accuse Rimuru of proclaiming himself a demon lord falsely, citing the destruction of the Falmuth army as proof of his uncontrolled ambition. It was a lie wrapped in a half-truth, the kind of political maneuvering that required a silver tongue to counter. Rimuru didn't have a silver tongue anymore. He took the envelope. The paper smoked slightly under his touch. Rimuru looked at Whis. The angel nodded once. This was the final exam. Rimuru did not rally his troops. He did not give a speech about protecting their home. He turned to Benimaru, who was standing by the ruined town hall, his red eyes burning with a need for violence that he was barely restraining. Rimuru ordered him to hold the line. If the Western Holy Church returned, they were to retreat into the labyrinth. There would be no more heroics, no more sacrifices. Rimuru would go alone. Whis would accompany him as an observer, not a participant. Ranga emerged from Rimuru's shadow, but Rimuru shook his head. He pushed the wolf back down. He would carry no passengers. If he died alone. Ramirez opened the gateway to the meeting place. Rimuru stepped through, leaving the grey rain of his broken home for the dimensional void of the Demon Lord's table. The transition was instant. The air in the Walpurgis Hall was dry, static-charged, and heavy with the scent of ozone and arrogance. The long table was already populated. Guy Crimson sat at the head, his aura a relaxed inferno. Milim Navar was there, sitting next to Clayman, her eyes dull, acting the part of the puppet. Ramirez flew to her seat, hiding behind her golem. The other lords, De Gruel, Dino, Valentine, watched the newcomer. They expected a monster. They expected a flare of haki. What entered was a human child in a black coat, who felt like nothing. Rimuru walked to his assigned seat. He did not leak energy. He did not project dominance. He felt like a stone on the side of the road. To beings who measured worth by the size of one's aura, he was invisible. Only Guy Crimson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not at Rimuru, but at the tall, pale figure standing silently behind the slime's chair. Guy recognized the signature of the staff. He recognized the nature of the being. A primal demon recognized a creature of the upper hierarchy. The tension in the room spiked, but not because of the accused. Clayman stood up. He began his theatrical performance. He struck Milim across the face. The sound echoed in the vast hall. In the canon timeline, Rimuru would have raged. He would have shouted. Here, Rimuru sat perfectly still. He watched Milim's head snap back. He saw the slight twitch in her eye. He knew she was acting, but he also knew that Clayman had touched what belonged to him. In his mind, Milim was his friend, and Clayman was a dead thing walking. Clayman droned on, presenting false evidence, claiming Rimuru had conspired with the humans to kill Falmuth's army and was planning to overthrow the council. He demanded Rimuru be executed for the crime of arrogance. Guy Crimson silenced Clayman with a wave of his hand. He looked at Rimuru. He asked the slime if he had anything to say in his defense. Rimuru stood up. He didn't look at Guy. He looked at Clayman. He spoke 3 words. He said he was there to take out the trash. Clayman laughed. He snapped his fingers. He summoned his puppets, the incomplete creations he had built from the corpses of ancient elves. He ordered Milim to kill the slime. Milim stood up. She summoned her fist armor. She charged. It was a test. Guy watched, intrigued. Would the slime die? Would the angel intervene? Milim threw a punch that broke the sound barrier. It was aimed at Rimuru's head. Rimuru did not dodge. He didn't block. He stepped forward, inside the arc of the punch. It was a suicidal move for a mage, but Rimuru was no longer a mage. He was a kinetic battery. He placed his hand on Milim's abdomen. He didn't attack. He pulsed his own frequency, a counter-vibration to the magicals powering her suit. It was a technique Whis had taught him for disrupting energy constructs. For a microsecond, Milim's armor flickered. She froze, her eyes widening. In that pause, Rimuru whispered to her. He told her to sit down and watch, or he would tell Veldora she broke the treaty. Milim blinked. The puppet act dropped for a split second. She grinned, spun around, and sat back down, folding her arms. Clayman stared, confused. He screamed at her to attack. She ignored him. He screamed at his puppets to attack. They rushed forward, blades drawn. Rimuru didn't draw a sword. He walked toward Clayman. As the first puppet swung a scimitar, Rimuru caught the blade, not with his hand, but with the air around his hand. He compressed the atmosphere into a solid shield, a trick of high-density physics. He twisted his wrist. The steel shattered. He punched the puppet in the chest. He didn't use strength. He used the erasure technique on a small scale. The puppet's core simply vanished. The doll collapsed. He walked through the barrage. He was cut. A blade grazed his cheek, drawing blood. But he didn't stop to heal. He didn't care. Pain was data. He reached Clayman. The Demon Lord, realizing his puppets were useless, panicked. He cast his ultimate spell, Demon Marionette, attempting to overwrite Rimuru's soul and turn him into a slave. The spell washed over Rimuru. It found no purchase. Rimuru's soul was not a loose cloud of energy anymore. It was a singularity, compressed by months of carrying the weight of the world. The spell slid off him like water off glass. Rimuru grabbed Clayman by the throat. He lifted the Demon Lord off the ground. Clayman kicked, clawing at Rimuru's arm. He fired blasts of energy into Rimuru's chest. Rimuru's coat burned away. His skin blackened. But he didn't let go. He squeezed. "You took her from me," Rimuru whispered. It wasn't about the politics. It wasn't about the council. It was about the empty grave in the plaza. You set the board. You moved the pieces. You killed my secretary. Clayman gagged, his eyes bulging. He realized he was dying. He realized this small, weak-looking child was not weak. He was dense. He was heavy. Clayman did the only thing he could. He sacrificed his own soul to trigger a forced awakening. He burned his life force to become a true demon lord right there in the grip of the slime. The energy explosion was massive. It blew the roof off the Walpurgis Hall. Rimuru was thrown back, skidding across the floor. Clayman emerged from the smoke, transformed. He was hideous, a giant of distorted flesh and raw power. His energy level skyrocketed, rivaling the lower tier of the awakened lords. He roared, a sound that shook the dimension. He fired a beam of disintegration at Rimuru. Rimuru stood up. He dusted off his pants. He looked at Whis. The angel was sipping a drink. He had materialized, unbothered by the destruction. Whis caught Rimuru's eye and nodded. The restriction was lifted. Not the restriction on power, but the restriction on technique. Rimuru looked at the giant Clayman. He didn't feel fear. He felt clarity. He realized that this was the end of his path as a monster. To kill this thing without becoming a demon lord, he had to use the power of a candidate. He had to use the power of destruction. Rimuru raised his hand. He didn't gather magicules. He gathered existence. He focused on the concept of Clayman, the strategy, the fear, the body, the soul. He visualized it all as a knot in the fabric of reality, and he decided to untie it. Hakai, Rimuru whispered. It was not the true Hakai of a god of destruction. Rimuru didn't have that authority yet. It was an imitation, a localized collapse of reality driven by his own life force. Purple energy, dark and granular, formed around his hand. It wasn't magic. It was the antithesis of creation. Rimuru vanished. He didn't teleport. He moved at the speed of the expansion of the void. He appeared in front of Clayman's chest. He pressed his hand against the giant's heart. Clayman froze. He looked down. He saw the purple light. He felt something he had never felt before. He didn't feel pain. He felt absence. He felt his history being deleted. He felt his future being cancelled. "Wait," Clayman screamed. "I surrender. I have information. The Eastern Empire, the angels, I know." "I don't care," Rimuru said. The purple light expanded. Clayman didn't explode. He eroded. His armor turned to dust. His flesh turned to dust. His bones turned to dust. His soul, trying to flee, was caught in the gravity of the destruction and ground down into nothingness. There was no reincarnation. There was no residue. In 3 seconds, the seat of the marionette master was empty. Rimuru fell to the floor. The technique had cost him. His arm was purple, the skin cracked and bleeding, the destruction recoiled, damaging his own pattern. He lay there, gasping, looking up at the stars visible through the broken roof. The silence in the hall was absolute. Even Guy Crimson was standing. He had seen magic for thousands of years. He had never seen someone weaponize the concept of deletion. Whis floated down. He tapped his staff on the floor. Rimuru's arm stopped bleeding. It didn't heal, but the erosion stopped. Whis looked at the gathered demon lords. "The seat is open," Whis announced calmly. "I believe the candidate has passed the entrance interview." Guy Crimson walked down from his throne. He stopped next to Rimuru. He looked at the small, broken slime. He looked at Whis. "What is he?" Guy said. "He isn't a demon lord. He refused the harvest. He isn't a hero. He has no blessing. What did you build, Angel?" "I built a janitor," Whis smiled. "Someone to clean up the messes you children leave behind." Rimuru sat up. He felt hollow. The vengeance was done. Clayman was gone, but Shion was still dead. The victory tasted like ash. He looked at the other demon lords. They weren't looking at him with mockery anymore. They were looking at him with caution. He had killed an awakened lord without using a unique skill. He had used a forbidden art. He was dangerous. "I claim his domain," Rimuru rasped. "I claim the Jura Forest. I claim the territory of the marionettes. Anyone who touches my town again gets the purple light. Are we clear?" Valentine nodded slowly. Dargrul crossed his arms and nodded. They accepted the new reality. The balance of power had shifted. A neutral zone had been established, enforced not by an army, but by a single entity capable of erasing a king. Rimuru stood up swaying. Milim rushed over, grabbing him before he fell. She didn't hug him. She held him up like a crutch. She looked at his burned arm. She looked at his face. She saw the change. The friend she wanted to play with was gone. In his place was a ruler. "Let's go home," Milim said quietly. "I don't have a home," Rimuru replied. "I have a fortress." They left Walpurgis. There was no banquet. There was no celebration. Rimuru returned to the Tempest Federation. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking. He walked through the gates. The citizens were waiting. They saw him. They saw he was alive. They saw he was injured. They didn't cheer. They knelt. It was a silence of absolute loyalty. Rimuru walked to the center of the plaza. He stood before Shion's grave. He placed Clayman's mask, which he had picked up from the dust, on the mound. It was a trophy and a warning. Whis stood on the balcony of the town hall, watching. He took a bite of a celestial peach, he murmured to himself. The child is dead. The candidate is born. The timeline is stabilized. Rimuru turned to face his people. He didn't smile. He raised his healthy hand. "We rebuild," he said. "Stronger, stone, steel, no more wood, no more mercy. If the world wants to be cruel, we will be the wall it breaks against." The construction began immediately. The Tempest Federation that rose from the ashes of the Falmuth invasion was not a utopia of monsters and humans living in harmony. It was a bastion. The walls were black stone. The laws were iron. Rimuru sat on his throne, not as a benevolent slime, but as the god of integrity. He ruled with fairness, but without warmth. He protected his people, but he kept them at a distance, afraid that if he loved them too much, he would fail them again. And in the shadows, the great sage, finally released from the full suppression, but changed by the exposure to Whis's energy, began to calculate a new path. It wasn't the path of Raphael, the Lord of Wisdom. It was something colder, something more analytical. It began to simulate the equation for a perfect world, a world where no one had to die, a world that required absolute control. Rimuru closed his eyes on the throne. He dreamed of Shan's cooking. He dreamed of the days when the worst problem was a goblin dropping a roof tile. He woke up to the sound of soldiers drilling in the courtyard. He looked at his hand, the one that had erased a soul. It was trembling. He made a fist. The trembling stopped. "Whis," Rimuru called out. The angel appeared instantly. "Yes, Lord Rimuru. What is the next lesson?" "The next lesson," Whis said, his eyes glinting in the dark, "is how to kill a dragon without touching it. The Empire is moving, and Veldora is their target." Rimuru stood up. The grief was still there, a stone in his gut, but it was fuel now. "Let them come," Rimuru said. The story of the slime who wanted to be a friend ended. The history of the arbiter who held the knife against the throat of the world began. The what if had become a what is, and the cost was everything he used to be. The chronicles of the post-Walpurgis era describe the rise of the Jura Tempest Federation, not as a golden age of prosperity, but as the beginning of the silent peace. The playful, chaotic nation of monsters that might have existed in another history was replaced by a geopolitical monolith. Travelers who visited the capital city of Rimuru in the years following the Clayman execution described a city of breathtaking architectural precision, built from black obsidian and reinforced steel. It was a city that did not celebrate festivals so much as it observed cycles of efficiency. The streets were clean, the crime rate was non-existent, and the citizens worked with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. They did not love their leader like a father. They revered him like a natural law. The grave of Shion became the geographical and spiritual center of the nation. It was never moved, nor was it ever expanded into a grand mausoleum. It remained a simple mound of earth in the plaza, surrounded by a perimeter of absolute silence. It served as a constant reminder of the price of weakness. New recruits to the Tempest military were sworn in before the grave, taking an oath not to protect the peace, but to eradicate threats before they could manifest. The doctrine of preemptive erasure became the standard military strategy. The Kijin, once vibrant and colorful personalities, became the terrifying enforcement arm of this doctrine. Benimaru, the commander of the Black Flame, was known across the continent not as a charismatic general, but as the Grim Reaper of the East. Internationally, the balance of power shifted permanently. The Western Holy Church, under the guidance of Hinata Sakaguchi, maintained a respectful non-aggression pact, acknowledging Rimuru not as a demon lord, but as a divine arbiter, a being who existed outside the binary of good and evil to maintain structural integrity. The Eastern Empire, sensing the anomaly, paused its invasion plans for a decade, recalculating the variables of war against an enemy who could delete matter. The fear of the purple light kept the borders static. There were no border skirmishes. There were no raids. To provoke Tempest was to invite immediate, total cessation of existence. Rimuru Tempest himself became a figure of myth, rarely seen by the common public. He spent his time in the high tower of the central citadel, managing the flow of magicals and the stability of the local dimension. He did not age, and he did not smile. He became the administrator that Whis had sought to create. The angel remained a constant shadow at his side, a teacher who had succeeded in his task, but perhaps failed the heart of his student. One historical record from a visiting bard notes that the great Rimuru sat on his throne, looking at the sunset, with eyes that were as deep and empty as the void he commanded. He had saved his people. He had secured their future for 1,000 years. He had achieved the perfect strategic victory. But as the bard noted, in a city of perfect walls and silent soldiers, the weather always felt a little colder than it did in the rest of the world. The timeline was stable, the variable was controlled, and the story of the slime was over. The age of the god began in the quiet, heavy dark.